When I hired a tutor for my daughter, I never imagined he'd end up with my wife instead. But after I discovered their betrayal, I set a plan in motion that would change everything, and make sure he'd regret ever crossing me. When we hired Mark, the math tutor, he seemed like the ideal solution. Our daughter, Lily, was struggling a bit with her math class, and her grades were slipping just enough to worry us. Mark came highly recommended, young, approachable, and great with high school students. He came over twice a week, and our arrangement seemed like the perfect solution. My wife, Emily, would be home when he arrived, and I would join them a bit later after work. Emily hadn't worked full-time since Lily was little. My income was enough to support us, so she'd stayed home and managed the household. It was something we both agreed on, and I'd always appreciated her dedication to Lily. Being around after school meant she could help with homework, coordinate activities, and be present in all the ways I couldn't. But as the weeks went on, things started to feel off. Nothing drastic at first, just small things that didn't seem important enough to dwell on. Emily seemed a little more energetic on tutoring days, always a bit dressed up, even though she'd often be in casual clothes otherwise. And I noticed how she'd bring up Mark in conversation a bit too often, usually praising how well he was working with Lily, how patient he was, how smart. Of course, I wanted our daughter to have the best support possible, so I brushed it off. Maybe she was just being friendly, I thought. After all, she was around during every session. But a strange feeling lingered, and I tried to ignore it. For a while, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. A few more weeks passed, and Mark's tutoring sessions became part of our routine. I tried to put my suspicions aside, chalking up Emily's enthusiasm about Mark to her wanting the best for Lily. But I started noticing more little changes that kept gnawing at me. Emily's appearance changed subtly. She was dressing up more, wearing a bit of makeup, even on days she'd normally be in sweats and a t-shirt around the house. When I asked her about it, she laughed it off, saying it was just a way to make herself feel better, to shake up the routine. And then there was how our schedules seemed to align a little too conveniently. Emily would text me to pick up some groceries or run an errand right around the time Lily's tutoring session ended, which kept me out later than usual on certain nights. I brushed it off as coincidence, telling myself I was just overthinking. After all, we were both committed to Lily's success, and if this tutoring arrangement helped her, then it was worth it. One evening, though, I came home a bit earlier than expected. I'd planned to surprise them all, maybe grab takeout and make an evening of it. But when I walked in, there was an odd stillness in the house. I could hear Mark's voice coming from the living room, but there was no sound of studying or Lily's usual questions. I peeked in, and to my relief, it was just a typical tutoring session. Lily and Mark were at the table, notebooks and worksheets spread out. Emily, however, was nowhere in sight, which seemed strange since she was always around for the sessions. I called her name, and after a moment, she came out of the hallway, saying she'd been organizing some boxes in the storage room. Her response felt a little hurried, a little forced, but I didn't push it. Still, as I watched her settle back into her usual routine, that gnawing feeling returned. As the weeks went by, my suspicions grew, even though I couldn't put my finger on anything concrete. I'd come home early again one evening, hoping to catch a glimpse of how these tutoring sessions were going and maybe shake off this nagging feeling. As I walked in, I expected to hear the usual sounds of Lily and Mark going over math problems. But when I entered the house, I found only Lily in the living room, working quietly on a worksheet. Mark and Emily were nowhere in sight, which struck me as odd since Emily was usually around for the sessions. I tried to sound casual as I asked Lily, "Hey, where's Mom?" Without looking up, she replied, she went with Mark to the garage. Said they needed something from storage. I paused, feeling a slight twist in my stomach. It seemed odd that they'd both need to leave during the middle of the tutoring session just for storage boxes. Trying to shake it off, I made my way toward the kitchen, telling myself I was probably just overthinking again. But as I stood there, I caught sight of them returning from the garage through the hallway, laughing softly at something. Their expressions were relaxed, maybe even a little too comfortable. When they saw me, Emily's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered, giving me a bright, cheerful greeting. Mark nodded with his usual politeness, though I noticed he seemed a little flustered. "Hey," I said, managing a smile. "Everything all right with the tutoring?" "Oh, yes," Emily replied quickly. "We just needed to grab a few things. All good now." She glanced at Mark, who offered a brief, awkward smile before heading back to Lily in the living room. I watched them for a moment, still feeling uneasy. It could all be nothing, just my imagination. But something in her quick, dismissive response left me wondering if there was more going on than I wanted to believe. I decided to keep a closer eye on things from now on, just to be sure. The unease hadn't left me since that last encounter, and it seemed to grow with every passing day. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, so I decided to come home early again, this time unannounced. Maybe I'd find that I was overthinking, that everything was just as it should be. But deep down, I knew I was looking for answers. When I walked in, the house was unusually quiet. I glanced around the living room and kitchen, expecting to see Mark and Lily going over their usual worksheets, but they were nowhere in sight. The silence was strange, almost unsettling, and I found myself straining to hear any sounds. Assuming they must be in Lily's room, I started down the hallway. But as I passed by the master bedroom, I heard a soft sound, a muffled groan. I froze, unsure of what I was hearing. My heart began to pound, the tension building as I stood there, trying to make sense of it. Not fully understanding what was happening but feeling the urgency in the pit of my stomach, I pushed open the door to my bedroom. As I pushed open the door, the scene in front of me made my heart drop. There they were, Emily and Mark, tangled together in a way that left no room for doubt. For a second, the shock rooted me to the spot, but then the anger erupted. "What's going on here?" I shouted, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Mark, get out of my house. Now." They both jumped, scrambling to separate, Mark fumbling to gather his things. His face was flushed, and he stammered out some incoherent apology before darting past me, practically tripping over himself as he hurried down the hall and out the door. I turned to Emily, who was already trying to pull herself together, her face pale. What are you doing, Emily?" I demanded, struggling to keep my voice steady as the weight of the betrayal settled in. "Where is Lily, anyway? Are you seriously doing this here, in our home?" She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off, the anger boiling over. "Do you even realize what you're allowing to happen? What if Lily had walked in instead of me? Do you think at all about what you're doing or who you're hurting?" She looked down, unable to meet my eyes, her hands shaking as she tried to speak. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I shook my head, feeling the disbelief and betrayal churn inside me. I didn't know who this woman in front of me was anymore. The person I thought I knew, the person I trusted, she was gone, replaced by someone willing to betray our family right under our own roof. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the pain was overwhelming. "You'd better have a good explanation, Emily," I said coldly, "because I'm done with the lies." Emily stood there, her face a mixture of shame and fear as she fumbled for words. She tried to gather herself, but each second of silence felt like a lifetime, my anger building as I waited for her to say something, anything, to explain what I'd just walked in on. I didn't mean for this to happen," she started, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake, just a terrible mistake." I laughed bitterly, the words tasting sour. "A mistake? You call this a mistake? You're in our home, Emily, our bedroom. And with our daughter's tutor, no less." She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off, unable to stop myself. "Where's Lily, anyway? Does she even know her tutor's been doing more than just helping with math? Emily flinched, looking down at her feet. She's at a friend's house for a project, she mumbled, as if that would somehow excuse her actions. I shook my head, the disbelief settling in. So you're telling me you've been sneaking around while our daughter's out of the house? Do you even realize how disgusting this is? Tears started to well up in her eyes, and she took a step toward me, reaching out as if to comfort me. I'm so sorry. I was feeling so alone, and Mark, he was just there. I know it was wrong, but I was lost, Anne. No, I interrupted, pulling away, unable to stand her excuses. Feeling alone doesn't excuse betraying me, betraying our family, like this. You had every chance to talk to me if something was wrong, but instead, you turned to him. Our daughter's tutor. She nodded miserably, wiping her tears. I don't know what to say. I know I've hurt you, and I don't deserve forgiveness. I was so confused. Confused? I spat. Well, let me make it simple for you. You've destroyed the trust in this marriage, Emily. You've made a choice that you can't take back. And right now, I don't even know if I want to hear anything more from you. She was sobbing now, her face buried in her hands, but I felt nothing but numbness. The woman I thought I knew was gone, and in her place was someone I could barely recognize, a stranger who'd put her own needs above our family's. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions alone. There was nothing more to say, and I needed time to decide if there was any way forward from here. I walked out of the bedroom, shutting the door behind me, feeling a strange numbness creeping in. The rage had subsided, replaced by an emptiness that left me cold and hollow. I sat down in the living room, staring at nothing in particular, trying to absorb the reality of what I'd just witnessed. Emily eventually emerged from the bedroom, her face pale and red from crying. She sat down across from me, silent, her hands fidgeting in her lap. For a while, we just sat there, the weight of everything unsaid filling the air between us. Finally, I broke the silence. I trusted you, Emily. I thought we were in this together. And now, after everything, you're telling me that you turned to our daughter's tutor because you were lonely? She nodded, sniffling as she tried to find her voice. I know it sounds weak, but it wasn't about him. I just felt so disconnected. From you, from myself. I don't even know who I am anymore. I shook my head, hardly able to believe what I was hearing. And this is how you deal with it? By destroying our family? Her gaze dropped, and she sat there in silence, wringing her hands. She had no real answers, no justifications that could even begin to explain away the damage she'd caused. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. What you've done isn't just a mistake, Emily. It's a betrayal. Of me, of Lily, of the life we've built together. She looked up at me, her eyes desperate. Please, let me make it right. I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, anything. Just, don't throw us away over this. Us? I scoffed. Do you really think there's still an us after everything I walked in on today? She flinched at my words, her tears returning. But I couldn't find it in me to offer her any comfort. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the Emily I thought I knew, and that realization cut deeper than anything else. After a long pause, I finally stood up, unable to sit there any longer. I need time. To think. To figure out what I want, if there's even anything left to save. But right now, I can't look at you. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out of the room, letting the silence hang heavy in the air behind me. It was the first step in facing a new reality, one where the life I'd known was gone, and in its place, a choice I wasn't ready to make. The days that followed were filled with an unbearable quiet. Emily tried to reach out several times, but I kept my distance, giving short answers or walking out of the room when she attempted to talk. I needed time to process, to understand the depth of her betrayal and what it meant for our family. Meanwhile, Lily remained blissfully unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. She'd come home from school, greet us with the same bright smile, and head off to her room to study. I couldn't look at her without feeling an overwhelming sense of guilt, for everything she didn't know, for the lies that had been woven into her life without her consent. She deserved better, and I owed it to her to handle this carefully. One evening, after putting Lily to bed, Emily approached me again, her expression strained and exhausted. She looked as if she hadn't slept in days, but I could barely muster any sympathy. She'd brought this on herself. "Can we please talk?" she asked quietly. Reluctantly, I nodded, gesturing for her to sit down. She took a seat on the couch, wringing her hands as she looked at me with pleading eyes. "I know I've ruined everything," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I know I don't deserve a second chance. But I love you, and I love our family. I want to do whatever it takes to make things right." I shook my head, feeling the familiar anger begin to rise again. "Make things right? Emily, you shattered my trust. You destroyed everything I thought we had. And it wasn't just one lie, you kept this going, week after week, knowing full well how much it would hurt me and our daughter if it ever came to light." She nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I was selfish, and I put my own needs above everything that mattered. But I want to fix it, if you'll let me." I let out a bitter laugh. "Fix it? How? Do you think there's a quick fix for something like this? You crossed a line that I can't just look past. And the worst part is, you weren't just lying to me, you were lying to our entire family." She looked down, her shoulders slumped, defeated. "I understand if you want a divorce. I can't blame you for that. But, can we at least try counseling first? For Lily's sake." At the mention of Lily, I felt a pang of guilt. She didn't deserve to be dragged into this mess, and the thought of tearing our family apart hurt more than I wanted to admit. But at the same time, I didn't know if I could ever truly forgive Emily for what she'd done. "Counseling?" I repeated, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. "And what exactly are we supposed to say? That you destroyed our marriage for some cheap thrill with our daughter's tutor?" Her face crumpled, and she took a shuddering breath, barely able to look at me. "I know it sounds impossible, but I'll do anything to make this right. Just, give me a chance. Please." I stood up, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice cold. "But don't expect an answer right away. I'm not sure you've earned that yet." I left her there on the couch, her face streaked with tears, and headed upstairs to the guest room, where I'd been sleeping since the night I'd caught them. Lying there in the dark, I tried to imagine a way forward, one that didn't involve more pain for Lily, one that didn't involve holding on to the anger that threatened to consume me. But forgiveness, if it was even possible, was still a long way off. And I wasn't sure if either of us had the strength to make it there. After several days of reflection, and for the sake of our daughter, I agreed to try counseling with Emily. It felt like a compromise, a way to explore whether any foundation remained that could be rebuilt. But I was clear from the start, I was there for answers, not for reconciliation. I wanted to understand why Emily had shattered everything we'd built together. Our first session was tense. Emily was visibly nervous, shifting in her seat, struggling to meet my gaze. The counselor, a calm, older woman named Dr. Larson, encouraged us to talk openly, to get to the root of what had happened. Emily began, her voice small and uncertain. "I know what I did was wrong, unforgivable, even. But I want to explain why. Not to make excuses but to help you understand." I kept my gaze steady, waiting. There was no apology that could erase what I'd seen, but if this process was going to mean anything, I needed to hear her out. She took a shaky breath. I felt lost. Stuck, maybe. When Lily got older and I was no longer needed at home in the same way, I didn't know what my role was anymore. Mark, he came along at a time when I was feeling invisible, and I let that get to my head. I clenched my jaw, feeling a familiar surge of anger, but Dr. Larson gently urged me to respond. You felt invisible. Emily, we've built a life together. I've always supported you, encouraged you to find work, to go after whatever made you feel fulfilled. She nodded, looking down at her hands. I know, and I see that now. I should have talked to you about how I was feeling. Instead, I went looking for validation in the wrong place, in the worst way possible. There was silence, a weight that lingered in the air. For a moment, I considered my own role in things, wondering if maybe I had missed signs or moments where she'd reached out. But the betrayal was hers, not mine, and that reality cut through any temptation to take on her guilt. As the session ended, Dr. Larson suggested we each think about what we truly wanted, whether that meant working toward rebuilding trust or preparing to separate. It was an invitation for clarity, but I didn't feel any closer to finding it. In the days that followed, we continued with counseling, each session peeling back layers of pain and anger. But I found myself wondering, was this enough? Could trust ever be rebuilt from the ashes of such betrayal? And more importantly, did I even want to try? Our next counseling session felt different, heavier. I'd been wrestling with my own thoughts, questioning whether I had any desire to salvage what was left of our marriage. And as we sat down, the silence between Emily and me was thicker than usual. I could feel her glancing at me, as if hoping for a sign that things might get better. But I was done pretending. About halfway through the session, I took a deep breath and looked directly at Dr. Larson. Is it normal that I don't want to restore anything? I asked, my voice steady but cold. I don't trust her, and I honestly don't want to live with a cheater anymore. Emily's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks as she tried to hold back her sobs. She looked at me, searching for something, maybe some hint of sympathy or a softening in my expression. But I didn't feel anything. Watching her cry didn't stir any pity in me, and I couldn't bring myself to care. I don't feel sorry for her, I continued, my voice flat. I don't care that she's crying right now, and I don't think I'll ever feel sorry for her. She's the one who broke our family, not me. I came here for clarity, but I think all I've found is that I don't want to be with someone who betrayed me like this. Dr. Larson nodded, her face neutral, but there was an understanding in her eyes. It's completely valid to feel that way, she said calmly. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and once it's broken, it can be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to rebuild. It's okay if you don't want to try. Emily sobbed harder, clutching at her tissue, her hands trembling. She tried to speak, her words barely a whisper. I thought maybe you'd still care enough to try. I shook my head, feeling an overwhelming sense of finality. Emily, you made a choice that showed me exactly where I stand in your life. You didn't think of our family, or of me, when you decided to betray us. So no, I don't feel like trying. I don't see a reason to fight for this. Her face crumbled further, but I looked away, feeling nothing but a hollow sense of relief. I had said my truth, and the weight of pretending was gone. Dr. Larson looked between us, sensing the shift. It seems that you're clear on what you want moving forward, she said gently. Sometimes, the healthiest choice is to let go. It's painful, but it can lead to healing in ways we don't expect. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. I didn't need to pretend or force myself to feel something I didn't. I had my answer, and it was time to move forward, without her. After that session, something shifted. I no longer felt tangled in doubt or guilt. The decision was clear, and I felt a quiet sense of peace, a strange relief from the months of turmoil. The thought of staying in a marriage where I was constantly questioning my wife's loyalty, where forgiveness felt like a mountain I couldn't climb, seemed exhausting and pointless. That night, I slept in the guest room again, but this time it wasn't out of anger or avoidance, it was a step toward moving on. The next morning, I called Emily into the living room. She entered, looking wary and a bit broken. I could tell she sensed what was coming, but she held herself together, waiting for me to speak. "I've made a decision," I began, my voice steady. "This isn't working. I can't pretend to be okay with what happened, and I can't see a future for us anymore. I think it's best if we separate." Emily's face fell, and for a moment, I thought she might protest, but she simply nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. I understand," she whispered, barely holding back her tears. I continued, my tone calm but firm. "We'll make this as easy as possible for Lily. She doesn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this. I want us to be civil for her, to make this transition as gentle as we can." She nodded again, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I know I ruined everything," she said softly, almost to herself. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know. I really am sorry." I acknowledged her words with a brief nod but didn't respond. Apologies wouldn't mend what had been broken, and we both knew that. The next steps were clear. Over the following weeks, we quietly began to plan for our separation. We agreed on custody arrangements for Lily, and I made sure to assure her that her life wouldn't be upended. Emily and I kept things respectful, both of us careful to keep any bitterness away from our daughter. In the quiet moments alone, I thought about what I'd lost but also what I'd regained, a sense of self, of freedom, and a chance to build a new future without the weight of betrayal. The healing wouldn't happen overnight, but I knew I'd come out of this stronger. And as I watched Emily pack her things, ready to start her life apart from mine, I felt ready to move forward, finally free from the shadows of doubt and betrayal. A few weeks after Emily moved out, I found out through mutual friends that she hadn't just gone off on her own, she'd moved in with him, the tutor, Mark. The man who had not only betrayed my trust but also crossed every line imaginable by being with a married woman right under her family's roof. The realization struck me hard at first, but that quickly turned into something else, a resolve, a need to make sure he understood the consequences of what he'd done. Mark had wrecked our family without a second thought, and I wasn't about to let him walk away unscathed. I began to quietly gather information. Over the next few days, I learned more about Mark's professional life. He was a private tutor, building his reputation on being trustworthy, dependable, someone parents could rely on. He'd grown his client list over the years, positioning himself as a respected educator for teens who needed a bit of extra help. I saw my path clearly. I decided to make it known exactly what kind of man he was. If he thought he could wreck someone's home without repercussions, he was about to find out how wrong he was. First, I reached out to some of the parents whose children he tutored. Through subtle conversations, I shared what had happened in my home. I didn't need to embellish the story, simply telling the truth was enough. Parents were shocked, some angry, some concerned that they'd trusted someone so morally bankrupt with their children's education. One by one, I watched his client list shrink as the parents began pulling their kids from his sessions. I knew his livelihood depended on his reputation, and now that was in shambles. But I wasn't done. I had another idea in mind, one that would ensure he'd think twice before pursuing a married woman again. I gathered the evidence I had of his affair with Emily, messages, emails, and even a few photos from his visits to our home. My goal wasn't just to hurt his reputation, I wanted to ensure that he could no longer find work in our community. I shared this information with local educational boards, some of whom had considered contracting him for tutoring services. The response was quick and decisive, they couldn't risk associating with someone involved in such a scandal. Mark's career was effectively over, his reputation ruined. And as the pieces of my plan fell into place, I felt a sense of closure. He'd thought he could walk away from the damage he'd caused, but now he was the one facing consequences. For the first time in months, I felt like I'd taken back some control. My life was far from perfect, but at least I could ensure that Mark would think twice before ever betraying someone's trust again. A few days later, Emily stormed into my home, her face flushed with anger. I wasn't surprised. I'd expected her to show up sooner or later after the fallout of Mark's ruined career. She stood there, fists clenched, and launched into me without even a greeting. "What did you do to him?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "Why did you have to destroy his entire career?" I leaned back, arms crossed, a calm I hadn't felt in a while settling over me. "Oh, so suddenly he's not so appealing without his steady stream of tutoring money, huh?" I replied, my voice laced with sarcasm. "Or does it just bother you that he's finally facing the consequences of his actions?" She scoffed, trying to hold on to her anger, but I could see the cracks. "This was unnecessary, and you know it. You could have walked away from this without tearing him down." I shook my head, unfazed. "You really don't get it, do you? He didn't just cross a line, Emily, he walked into our lives, into our home, and tore apart everything I cared about. And he did it without a single thought for anyone but himself. You both did." She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. "Let him learn what it feels like to have something meaningful stripped away," I continued. "Maybe next time, he'll think twice before ruining someone else's family. And maybe you will, too." She was visibly taken aback, but she didn't back down. "I came here because I care about him," she insisted, a defiant edge in her voice. "You went too far." I looked at her, shaking my head in disbelief. "You care about him? That's what brought you here, Emily. Not our daughter. Have you even thought about Lily lately? She's the one who's had her life turned upside down. But, no, you're here for him. You haven't even made an effort to be there for your own daughter. Some mother you turned out to be." Her expression shifted, the anger dimming as the truth of my words hit her. I saw a flash of guilt in her eyes, but I wasn't in the mood for more of her excuses. Lily was my priority now, and she was the only one in this situation who hadn't betrayed anyone. "If you want to be angry with someone, go ahead," I said, my voice ice cold. "But don't show up here pretending it's about anything other than your own choices. Lily deserves better than that. We both do." Emily stood there, speechless, her anger melting into something else, maybe regret, maybe realization. But I didn't care to decipher it. "Now, if that's all you came here for," I said, opening the door, "I think we're done." Without another word, she turned and walked out, leaving me standing alone with the door open, finally feeling free. In the months that followed, everything changed. Emily eventually left Mark, too, whether it was the strain of his ruined career or just the realization that their relationship had been built on lies, I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't care. But after that, her presence in our lives grew fainter and fainter. At first, she tried visiting Lily every couple of weeks, each time with strained attempts to reconnect. Then, the visits became less frequent, the time between them stretching out, until one day, she simply stopped coming altogether. Lily noticed, of course. She tried to hide the hurt, but I could see the confusion and sadness in her eyes each time her mom missed another promised visit. The pain of feeling abandoned by her own mother weighed on her, a hurt that no child should have to bear. I knew I needed to help her make sense of it, but I also knew that this was a wound that would need more than words. One evening, I sat down with Lily, gently explaining that none of this was her fault, that she was deeply loved, and that her mom's choices had nothing to do with her. But it was clear she needed more help than I alone could provide. So I found a skilled psychologist who specialized in helping kids process difficult family issues. Every week, Lily went to her sessions, and I watched as she slowly started to let go of the sadness, the questions, and the anger. The therapy helped her rebuild her sense of self, giving her the tools to move forward without carrying the weight of her mother's absence. As for me, my life took on a new and steady rhythm. My days were filled with work, building a supportive home for Lily, and staying focused on our future. There was no time to dwell on the past. I'd had my share of heartbreak, but Lily's needs kept me grounded, kept me going. We grew closer, and our bond became stronger than ever as we navigated this new chapter together. Looking back, what I'd once thought of as a terrible loss had become a new beginning. Emily's betrayal had scarred me, but it had also given me a renewed sense of purpose. I'd come through it with clarity, no longer haunted by what I'd lost but focused on what I'd gained, a stable, loving relationship with my daughter, built on trust and resilience. Life settled into a calm, fulfilling routine, and for the first time in a long while, I felt genuine peace. I no longer worried about Emily or Mark, they were echoes from a past that no longer defined me. Lily and I had rebuilt our lives, creating a home filled with honesty, laughter, and mutual respect. And every day, when I saw her smile or heard her laugh, I knew we'd made it through, stronger and more connected than ever. In the end, I'd found something better than revenge or resentment. I'd found the life I was always meant to live, and I was grateful for the peace that came with it.